Dartmouth. I am very pleased to share a platform with you. Your expertise and knowledge as an MEP and representing here in the West Country was very clear-cut, very obvious. And it is a tribute to all of you who are campaigning to lose your jobs. Not many people do that. So I think it's a really good occasion to try and look now at some of the reasons why I, a very convinced European, have come to the view that this is our last opportunity. I just don't believe in the referendum that we've already seen any Conservative government, and it looks very unlikely it would ever happen from a Labour government, will ever give us another referendum. The traumas, the, in my view, grotesque manipulation of this referendum has made it extremely unlikely that anybody is going to subject their political party to the same traumas, divisions. It's just not likely. And I think the way we will see Europe emerge in the future is through manifesto commitments. So we then need to think, about that. You get your mandate in your general election and then you do things. And I think that's how we need to look forward. And it's not a very good or present picture. Let me start just where I started. I was selected as the Labour candidate for Torrington in the summer of 1962. The first meeting I ever went to was to try and have a campaign to save Appledore Shipyard. The then Conservative Member of Parliament for that constituency was a very much loved figure called Sir Percy Brown, a farmer. And I learned something that very first meeting. You don't have to be partisan on everything you do in politics. You can combine across party political divisions when it's necessary. And in 1975, in the referendum, which we had under the Wilson government, what a different referendum that 75 referendum was to the one we're just now living in. Whatever your views, whatever your politics, this was a genuine chance to have a listen, to hear a fairly unbiased case put on both sides. And people debated amongst each other. Tony Benn went on the same television program as Roy Jenkins, and they were able to debate the issues. And Wilson said, with Callaghan as his foreign secretary, if you decide to not take our advice, and they made clear they would wish us to stay, we will implement it. Well, that's the same phraseology as David Cameron started the campaign. It's becoming harder and harder to see how he would do that. I think he must. I think his duty to stay. Maybe he'll leave politics a little earlier than he planned. But on the 24th of June, if he faces the decision, as I profoundly hope, of the British people that we are leaving, he can't cut and run the next day. After all, we're not electing a government here. That's been done a year ago. This government will run in a fixed-term parliament almost certainly to 2020. Very, very difficult to have a general election. So we are vesting in the Conservative government the responsibility for carrying out our decision. That's why this referendum is not like a general election and should not be handled like a general election. But I'm a great believer in politics is don't whinge, fight. And when I heard three people who I broadly respect, though they've never been in my political party, Michael Heseltine, John Major, and William Hague, all in the space of one day, no doubt planned, telling us that if the British people voted to come out, then Scotland would separate. I decided I was not going to spend 3 months of this campaign sitting in the sun in Greece. I was going to get off my hind horse and campaign. Because it is fairly conducted, certainly in comparison to this one, to make their choice. And I said, and many said, and Alex Salmon said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime choice. And I say the same this time about this choice. They knew in 2014 that David Cameron had said that there would be a referendum on the question of Europe. He said it a year before. There is no question of any British government. And David Cameron knows it perfectly well, but he won't say it. They will not accept a referendum in Scotland. You don't have referendums every 2 or 3 years, just on opinion polls. If it became the very obvious, over a long period of time, wish for Scotland to leave, we would have to have a proper referendum again. One which we would all be committed to accepting the advice. So let's face what is the realities. The reality is this is a choice for all of us in the UK. The realities are we will have to accept the decision. I will accept the decision if it goes against us. So don't whinge, fight. And put the arguments in the sensible, coherent way that we've heard today about trade. I too learned something. And there is an advantage for people who have the expertise, who've lived with it day after day in the European Parliament, who've seen the distortions and the miscalculations, to listen to the objective thing. Now, it's a long time ago since I was on an election platform. 87 was the last time I campaigned. Reference was made to the fact that I was the EU negotiator in the former Yugoslavia for nearly 3 years. And I was well supported by the European Union. It was a very, very difficult time. I sometimes say it was my penal servitude to have to do this. But after it, I never accepted a penny from the government. I went out and earned my living in the markets of the world. I traded steel and iron ore from Russia. I was involved in the healthcare industry in the United States, and I was chairman of my own company here in the UK. And I learned one thing about trade, that the key thing is price. The next thing is design, and the third thing is to deliver at the right time. And a lot of this apparatus of trade means nothing in the real instance. You're on the end of a phone, or more importantly in these days in a computer, and the bargaining is on those 3 issues. And that is why this country has been, over many centuries, great traders, great world traders. And I refuse to accept that this country cannot do it again. There may be let's face it, every action we would take would be according to the treaty. The treaty I hate most, actually, the Treaty of Lisbon, because it allows for a procedure for this country legitimately to leave the European Union. And it doesn't happen next day, or it doesn't happen next month. There's a 2-year transition, and if you have agreement, unanimous agreement, it can be extended year by year. I don't personally think it makes any sense to have a negotiation that goes on longer than 3 years, because a year after that, we'll be into a general election. And so the British people have the right to believe that this government will honourably listen to us. If we vote to leave, that vote will have to be reflected in the British cabinet. I hear David Cameron telling us in Parliament that on day 1, I will sign the Article 50 that takes us out. No, Mr. Prime Minister. If we vote on the 23rd, the Cabinet and Parliament will decide how we handle those negotiations. Not you. We've got used in this country to thinking that the Prime Minister is a president. It started under Tony Blair, and it's certainly continued under David Cameron. We appoint a Prime Minister through the process of the choice of the people of this country, through their party. We elect somebody who we know is likely to be the Prime Minister if the party wins. And we expect the Prime Minister to be primus inter pares, first amongst equals, but the equals of the members of the Cabinet. And I want to hear a great deal more in this country when we take back our democracy, when we take back our parliamentary democracy, that we have cabinets that work. How did Attlee handle the cabinet? How did even Margaret Thatcher handle the cabinet? It's a new issue, this question of prime ministerial government. And I want to restore the full measure of parliamentary democracy that we've had in the past. When the Chilcot report comes out about the mess that we got ourselves into in Iraq and Afghanistan, it will reveal, above all, not the vindictive against the people who do that, it will show that our structure of government, our democratic government, broke down, and we want to never see that happen again. Come back with me to Appledore in 1962. Some of you have been there. Lovely little village, you go down a steep hill down to the bottom, and there's a fantastic port. In 1962, it was packed with fishing boats. It historically has been one of the great fishing ports of this country through the centuries. A few weeks ago, the last fishing vessel, the Hannah Marie, was shipped across the seas to Denmark. And the whole of the ray fishing industry, which is in the Bristol Channel, has dramatically changed. They're still fishing for them in Milford Haven. But where do the majority of the boats come from? Belgium. You saw that tragic figure. Unbelievably moving, I thought, to watching those small numbers of boxes and realizing the hardship that has hit the fishing industry, and you can still see it if you go to Grimsby or you go up through the coast right through to Scotland. I remember in 1992, I always get my years wrong, so I'm sure I'm wrong on that, 1972, I'm allowed a few licenses now at the great age of 77. Going to Norway at the express invitation of the Prime Minister of Norway, because he wanted a young Labour person to go and argue why they should join the European Union. And sitting on the same platform with me, it was a man I had much admired, Willy Brandt, who has been the mayor of Berlin in all those difficult years, and the Chancellor of Germany, and had spent times in Norway, exiled, self-exiled, because of him being a social democrat from Germany and Norway. And you know, I suddenly realized I was in the wrong meeting. The hostility of the Norwegian people to this young pup from UK coming and telling them what they should do, but even more, it was felt about Willy Brandt. And I spent the whole time saying, of course, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm not here to tell you to have a vote. After saying it about 5 times, somebody said from the back of the hall, well, why the hell are you here? Now, one of the more unattractive aspects of this referendum are the number of people who from foreign countries come and tell us how to deal with it. And I don't know about you, but when Boris Johnson took on President Obama, I was pretty pleased. Now, you know, Debbie, many of you in this hall know her. I mean, she's American. And she's an Obama mom. She supports everything he does. And she's a great supporter. But when she heard him say, "You'll be at the back of the queue," like a good American, she laughed and laughed and laughed. Because in America, you're back of the line. And she knew then that that speech, those sentiments had been direct from number 10, direct from Cameron. Come and help me in this crisis. And when you weren't puzzled why all these heads of government and all these people pile in from the international body, you have to understand it. Right? It's the world I used to live in as foreign secretary. There's a trade union of heads of governments and foreign secretaries. You work together, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And basically, you don't interfere in other people's countries unless they ask you to, beg you to come into them. And that's why you're meeting this thing. To actually get up and say Britain should leave, you wouldn't have seen insulting the Prime Minister of this country, you'd be having problems with the other 27 members of the European Union. So this is actually a moment to put that whole thing in their perspective. They're coming here often to protect their own interests. And I think we need to take this into account. Now, just for a short time, I'll deal with fishing and then I'll try and deal with a few other issues. Because I think it is important to remember, we're pretty fortunate here in Plymouth. The ups and downs of our fishing industry have been tragic to watch. But there have been ups, and we're in an up phase now, and we've got an extremely efficient industry in this city of Plymouth, and with some very considerably talented people who invested and made it successful. But how much more successful it could be if we were outside the EU. Now, nothing is going to totally change. You know, we have traditional fishing rights with France going back centuries, and other countries too. Although it's tempting to think of the map, that we'll have 200 miles of water all around the island suddenly returned to us, that won't be like that. We have to work within international agreements and arrangements. We all know that the fishing industry is very delicately balanced, and if anybody goes out there without some form of overall sustainability, we'll outfish and then we get nothing. I see that in my house in Greece, where I fish these days more than I used to do in the Plymouth Sound. And we've fished out large parts of the Mediterranean, sadly. So we can't, and on conservation too, and young people desperately interested in this whole issue. How do we deal with whales? What do we do with the shark industry? There's a whole real commitment to trying to protect and conserve the seas. And we have to work internationally on that. But the difference, the thing to understand, is that Britain will be there, as of right, managing quite substantially parts of this international agreement. The whole thing will be different. And slowly and steadily we can get a better deals, fairer deals. I've put out a lot of the detail of all this, but I'm not going to weary you with that. But it is very important for the fishing industry that they should know that some of us understand the complexities and the problems of it. But we here have one duty, which is to stand by this industry, which was one of the great industries of the West Country, and say to our people here, this is one thing that is dramatically going to change down here in the West Country. This isn't an idle promise. It will take a few years to build back, take a little time, but you will start to see a fishing industry that we can remember, and it will be right around our coasts. It will change, and it will change positively for the better. And some of us remember the extraordinary way in which the common fishery policy was imposed. The day before we started the negotiations, they suddenly took, without any warning whatever, all the fishing in the European waters suddenly became a common fishing policy. And we had to negotiate against that. Now, I know there's a great deal of bitterness about that negotiation, but it was a very difficult negotiation. I don't often say much in support of the Ted Heath government, but they basically decided to write it off. They knew they couldn't achieve anything. And another British Prime Minister has written off the fishing industry. Did you hear anything from David Cameron in his so-called renegotiations that affected the fishing industry? Not one little bit. It was given up completely. There is only one way you can restore the fishing industry, and that is to vote out. I don't say this should be the only issue. Even I, that love the National Health Service, and appalled what has happened to the National Health Service, and watched as the European Union, particularly since about 2002, began to get more and more involved. And the reason? We decided to marketize the National Health Service. We decided to, not me personally, but the government of the day. I accept it. I'm a Democrat. They won elections. They were able to make these changes to the National Health Service. But there's one thing I cannot accept, that you can never reverse it. And I tell you, you will not go back. to the great vision of an Aaron Bevan and the National Health Service that came into this country in 1948. Unless you win back the power to make decisions in a British Parliament. And this is what's changed. Barbara Castle said to me in the 1975 referendum, she was my boss. We had different views about politics. She was further on the left than I was. Though I must say, I now find myself further on the left than the mainstream of the Labour Party, but that's another thing. But she said to me, David, this common market will eventually penetrate the National Health Service. These common market rules will stop. I just scoffed it. I said, Barbara, you're grotesquely exaggerating, and nothing will happen. And nothing did happen until the license for it came from within our own political system. Okay, that's right. But you see this happening, and this new treaty they're trying to agree. Do you realize that this commission negotiated year on in the so-called TTIP with the United States? Nobody knew what was going on. No governments really knew what was going on. The commissioner held it entirely within this secret negotiation, and then we suddenly discovered that health and the National Health Service would be covered by it. They're denying it at their peril, but they're still denying it. One of the great things that's happened in this campaign so far is the Conservative MPs, who not before really focused on this issue, have begun to read the treaty and see some of the impact of it. And so we had a resolution on Monday in the House of Lords, carried unanimously, regretting that there was no bill to deal with the problems of the National Health Service in the TTIP. Of course, they didn't believe a word of it, but it was with Conservative votes. Without them, we would never have been able to get that agreement. And the same thing happened in the House of Commons a few days later. And that's one of the advantages of this type of campaign. When you meet on platforms, you meet to share views, you begin to understand some of the positions of the other people. And there are Tory MPs that have said to me, we defend what we're doing on the National Health Service, but we defend your right, if you get a Labour government back again, to change it back if you wish to. That is the essence of our democracy. Go on allowing the European community to go into every nook and cranny. I was very struck when you said how we used to have 2 commissioners out of 13, and one of those was in the second tier underneath the chairman and the president of the commission. I was struck by that film. I was the one who wanted you to see it, because when I watched it, I thought I knew a lot about the European Union. I learned a great deal about it through that film, and there's more to come if you want to listen at the end. Now, I'm one of those people, and some of you know it, I'm sometimes called a moderate. I'm not altogether sure that's an appropriate way of describing my attitude to the reforms of the National Health Service, but put it on one side. But I do believe this, that it's very rare that any real issue worth arguing can be won 100 to 1, 100 to 0. It's usually, you're doing well to win 60 to 40, and you well have to settle 55 to 45. I mean, this is the way these things happen. And what I dislike about the whole of this debate that's been going on is this granting of a referendum, getting it right up to the point where you're actually starting the referendum campaign, and then suddenly you're told there's no argument. It would create Third World War, all in the headlines of newspapers. Not said by the Prime Minister next day, but anticipated in all what he said, implying that. This is bogus nonsense, and we in this city know it better than anywhere else. The thing that has saved us from the Third World War was the decision actually in 1946 of President Truman to cancel the decision to bring the US troops back from Europe, change his mind very visibly, and take on his critics in the country and say they've got to stay. What was emerging in the Soviet Union under Stalin was threatening and dangerous, and he started to keep them there. And then there were the achievement of NATO. 2 great statesmen, one of them General Marshall, who had been the real man behind the US military drive, staying close to the President Franklin Roosevelt, giving up the chance of military command in the field, which every general wants. And we had a similar man, Alan Brooke, Viscount Alan Brooke has later been, who stayed with Churchill all through the war, and like a good, tough Northern Irishman, argued with Churchill in 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Now that man Marshall was matched on the British side by Ernie Bevan, a remarkable man who was born, actually, illegitimate son in Somerset, and one of the greatest political figures this country, in my view, has ever had. And I say to you, they built NATO, and that is the finest military alliance that anywhere in the world has seen. Remember, when the League of Nations broke down, it broke down because Woodrow Wilson couldn't convince Congress that he could commit to real serious peacekeeping because they would not accept that they could be in control of their forces by anything other than the president. NATO overcame that. NATO gave us Article 5, which allows us to go to war to save the member states if their independence is threatened and challenged. And I say to you, to try and pretend that the European Union has been the thing that sacrificed and made great strains. We paid 9% of our GDP towards defense after that war, when we were still extremely weak. All through the 50s and 60s, we held serious forces, which made it possible for NATO. We're not going to be told now that the saving of the war, of the Third World War, by a person who wasn't even a boy during it. And then I heard from the Prime Minister the use of the word moral. Now, we all know what happens. You brief moral, but the reverse of it is immoral. That's the point I can't take any longer. I'm not prepared to take that those of us who wish to leave the European Union at this stage are immoral. Let's take the emotion out and let's look at some of the issues. The thing that changed Europe for me, and I was a strong supporter of it, and I don't deny it, were two things. This young doctor who knew nothing about politics in 1962 heard the then leader of my party, the Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, spell out for the first time to the British people, first on television and then to a Labour Party conference. He said, European unity is a good thing. This is a man who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Attlee government. European unity is a good thing. But, he said, if it means the emergence of a United States of Europe, where Britain is just a province, like, say, California or Florida in the United States, then I am opposed to it. He said it is possible for it to emerge without that. It can be a manifestation of working together as good neighbours, as Europeans. But it holds within it, because he talked to the people who were designing it, and the founding fathers, Monet, the Frenchman, Spark, and others. And he warned us. And that's why I have never shifted from believing that we are not prepared as a country to join a federalist union. When I became a young Foreign Secretary in 1977, Jim Callaghan sent me a note. Said, we're going to have a one-day cabinet meeting, and I want you to write the papers, not the diplomats. I want this to be a gathering of Labour Party people who can decide how we're going to handle this and spread it down through the government. And it was a commitment to be good Europeans, but an absolute rejection of federalism. So, I don't say this to say I have not changed my mind. If the facts change, I change. But I have never believed, and have never preached, and have never argued here, in this city, ever, for a federalist Europe. And what changed was when we decided to create a currency in 1990. And from that moment on, and with Janet, an extremely able and effective director of the New Europe, we opposed possibility that we would have a Eurozone referendum in 2003 on what in 2002 they were calling in Downing Street the back of the Baghdad banks. Well, tragically, we had no success in Baghdad in 2003, we still haven't now. I'm not going into that whole issue, except to say there was a very real threat that Tony Blair would have called a Eurozone referendum on joining the Euro in 2003, and it was vital. And some people on a cross-party basis got together and we campaigned with Business for Sterling, and the argument was yes to Europe, no to the Euro. And why? Because it is the founding element of a United States of Europe. You cannot have a single currency without a single country. I profoundly ask you to look at that. Look at the history. Charlemagne, the first empire that they tried to build in Europe, they had a currency. It collapsed. There's history pages are written about creating currency, unpatriotic or any of this stuff. It's just, we know what we love. We know that we have built a democracy here that works. We lived for years, some of us, waiting for our party to have power. We do eventually have an alternation of power. And on balance, you get it right. I've been kicked out of government twice. 1970 and in 1979. I didn't appreciate it at the time, to make it quite clear. But it wasn't more than a few weeks when I began to ponder, well, maybe the electorate got it right. Think of that great victory for Labour in 1945. Nobody predicted it. Some people thought they might scrape home, but massive majority. And I will rejoice in it. And I think most fair-minded people believe they didn't necessarily like it, didn't think well of it, but that it was a democratic expression and a legitimate, radical change of direction in many respects. And I think the same thing happened in '79. I think the country did see that the trade union power had to be dealt with. I think they did see that we had to earn our living in the markets of the world, and we had to be more competitive, and we had to be more effective and efficient. I never liked the Tory government, but I think it's part of the general British tradition that when I now go in through the lobby of the House of Commons from time to time, not a great attender, I have to tell you, in the House of Lords, which I consider rather illegitimate since you're not elected. But when I go now back into that lobby, if you walk into the actual chamber, there's Winston Churchill and there's David Lloyd George, which, with Welsh heritage, I respect, so conservative and liberal. But as you walk in from the House of Lords and Central Lobby, you have Clement Attlee, who's been there on the pedestal for quite some time, and now you have Margaret Thatcher. We have a way of tolerating political differences. We have a way of living together with alternation of power. And it suits us, and I think it's given us prosperity. I think it's helped to give us peace, and I think it's helped to give us unity in difficult times. And I think it's precious. And I believe it's challenged. And I believe it's challenged in an extremely profound way. So I am happy to speak on this platform. When I used to say to Debbie when this referendum was first announced, and I deplored both the manner in which it was announced, and I deplored the timetable in which it was given, and a variety of things. And I fought for the last 5 years, writing books, going around Europe, trying to get them to understand that they can keep Europe united if you give up freedom of movement of labour inside the single market. You don't need it in the single market. It's another of these pressures for a United States of Europe. You need a single market, you need a freedom of movement of labour and people in a Eurozone, in a currency union. And you need it in a United States of Europe, but you don't need it in a trade agreement and in the single market. But by forcing it in, refusing to change, it has made it inevitable. We have to withdraw and find new markets, not within the framework of the single market legislation. But as you heard today, the idea that they're going to suddenly stop all trade is perfect. It's asinine, actually. Completely ridiculous. What politicians are sent there to do is to look after the best interests of their country. Can you really see a German Chancellor suddenly saying that they will have to face either tariffs or obstacles to selling cars into this country? You know, walk around the street, see where their cars are. And the same thing happens to France. We buy more champagne, I think, than almost any other country in the world per head. Well, we're doing quite well with our own wine industry. And it's got bubbles in it, and if we're outside the EU, we'll be able to call it champagne. And also our cheese industry is doing frightfully well. We don't call it camembert, we have to call it something else. But we will start calling it camembert, and we will start calling it a few other French names. Now, we're not going back to that sort of world. I say it, Mr. Chair, we aren't prepared to do that, and they're not fools. We will form a bilateral trade agreement. May not be quite as advantageous in some respects, but we don't want it to be, because we want the freedom to be able to go out and create different markets. So I say to these people who perpetrate fear, I was very pleased to see the other day that one of the external advisors to the Governor of the Bank of England broke ranks. He's in the Times on Thursday. And this man said, the Governor rather unadvisedly said, you know, that we'd be at the mercy of strangers as to whether or not we'd be accepted. He said his experience was that in the arrangements, they made their own decisions. And he said, this country is highly investable, whether you're in or out of the euro. And I thought to myself, at long last, an honest man. And I tonight, emotionally and happily in this city which I was born and loved. It's not easy, these choices. It's not easy for the average person to sort it out. And I began to wonder what was going to happen. Well, we spent a couple of hours down on the sundial issuing leaflets for this campaign. And many people came up to me who actually I knew, I recognized. And it was extraordinary, really, in just such a short time to meet 5 or 6 people I actually knew, but lots more who knew me. And I'm not doing a count, I'm not predicting the result of the election. But the thing that I liked about it was just in these short exchange of views, people had seen through all this fear stuff. There was a real sense of up yours. You know, now I hope this isn't just a West Country spirit, because we're fighters here. We're merchant adventurers. We've tamed the seas. We've sailed the seas. We've fought our battles. I believe it's the spirit of the British people. And I profoundly hope we have the courage of our convictions on the 23rd, and we vote to keep our country, to keep it, and to sustain it. Well, I was party to it, and I may well have been wrong. But I do think we have to ask ourselves, what was the question that we were asked? We called it, actually in the referendum in 1975, a common market. Roy Jenkins and Edward Heath were controlling the, if you like, the designated group for saying yes. They actually wrote in this that the talk about monetary union was over, that was sidelined, was not going to happen. And in retrospect, that was the wrong judgment. And I think that both of them went on, of course, to argue passionately for a single currency. And I think that they must answer to some extent for that issue. But overall, the British people knew that they were giving up a measure of sovereignty. I agree with the person who said it's a hateful word. But it is, because it isn't the right word, really. What you are doing is pooling decision-making in organizations which are not coherent unless they are multinational. We do that in the United Nations. The great success of the United Nations was it was realistic enough to recognize the reality, the realpolitik of power. So 5 countries, of which we are one, have a veto. And without that veto, they bleat about it all over the world. But the honest answer, we'd never have had the UN, and it still is a viable, substantial, and great improvement in the years before we had any form of overall power. So people thought on Europe, and NATO was a success, and a consensual organisation. No qualified majority voting existed in '75. There's no system for having qualified majority voting in any substantive way until we actually had the single market. And it was Margaret Thatcher, incidentally, one of the, definitely a Eurosceptic, who agreed it was necessary in order to do these complex trade agreements and also vested power in the Commission. But still, we had substantive veto powers, we had substantive commitment to consensual decision-making. Nobody thought we were going to have a common defence policy, and when I was Foreign Secretary in '77, we had a thing called political cooperation, which was coordination of foreign policy. There was no possibility of voting or anything like that. Now, it has remorselessly and quite slowly and almost imperceptibly changed. And that's why I do think it is reasonable for at least those of us who wanted excuses as to why we were so foolish to support it. Maybe we all need it. But I mean, we also endorsed it democratically by a large majority at the referendum of '75. What changed? And it is the euro. You honestly cannot look at the European development without realizing the gigantic major step that came with the euro. Now, the Bundesbank didn't like it. They were against it. Chancellor Kohl forced it through because Mitterrand wanted to tie a reunified Germany in and thought that the monetary union. The French, when they voted for it, voted by the narrowest of margins. Some people think it was their overseas territories that swung it. It was absolutely knife edge. And this thing was then an experiment. And it hasn't worked. And we've been trying to get it to reform itself for over 6 years. The Americans, day by day, go in all the time, getting them to change it. They can't change it. They're locked. It is stagnant, politically, as well as economically. So I think, to answer your question why, it was entered into with honourable intent. It knew that Hugh Gaitskell's warning was serious. It had always within it resistance to the United States of Europe. And we thought we could get away without going that far. We now know you can't. And we should say to those who want to do it in Europe, good luck to you. We're not about to try to destroy it. A collapse of the Eurozone, to the country the size of Italy, very likely, in my view, even within 3 years, certainly within 5, makes it, to my view, very risky to stay. Every year we can push ourselves out, come out with this transitional arrangement before a collapse is good. I prefer the former governor of the Bank of England's advice. Read his book. It's an extremely good book, Mervyn King. And in it he says absolutely clearly, the euro crisis will continue. That means we've had it since 2010 and it's going to go on. A euro collapse is inevitable unless you create the structures of a United States of Europe which could support it. And probably by almost definition, much smaller than the current 19 Eurozone states. So that's it. That's the change. You may have been right in 1975 and voted no. And you have the entitlement to tell us all I told you so. And we must accept that. And we've all of us had to rethink. But never be afraid of changing your mind. It was Keynes who said, if the facts change, I change my mind. And the facts have certainly changed. There is actually, and it was mentioned by William in his speech, and that is the Czechoslovakia. And that has been done within the European Union. It was it's done within the commitment. They were coming into the European Union. And chose two different currencies. But the interesting thing is that Slovakia did use the opportunity to transform its economy, and the Czech one was for a while pretty stagnant. But there are examples where you can divide the country and to change. The Singapore one is a very interesting. When I was Minister for Navy, I went to Singapore, and I saw a map in which they marked the areas which were owned by the Ministry of Defence. I was absolutely staggered. I mean, it was more than 50% of the country, of the island. It was absolutely unbelievable. And I also had lunch with Lee Kuan Yew, who was very, very excited about the whole thing. And at that time didn't see really the potential for dramatic change. They now have no tariffs. Very interesting example. Not only have they, and if you go to China, they control an area outside Shanghai with the permission of the Chinese government to introduce Singapore practices. Now, there are some criticisms I have of the Singapore government's human rights record and some attitudes which I don't like. But in terms of what you can do with determination and drive, how you can reorientate a country, it has been done and it will be done in future, and we can do it. And getting that more positive note out, I hope to hear much more. We are getting more and more smaller companies. The big companies are almost lost to us. And that was one of the more disgraceful aspects of David Cameron's campaign, of getting in the head of Circa, which actually incidentally has a contract with running the hospitals here. And it's got big government links to plan a strategy while he was still meant to be renegotiating for convincing the 500 FTSE companies in number 10 with the Prime Minister still heading for what was meant to be negotiations. So we've got to be very careful about this whole issue. But that voice of enterprising new industries, and you know, a lot of the city of London welcome this. They want to have this challenge. They will adapt. They are confident. And we want to listen more to the entrepreneurial, adventurous voices. And we've got to get that into more of our younger people. And that is a challenge for us, and I think it's right to hear more if there are people who want to speak. We have to recognize this country has a political debate on the very issues that worry you, and it doesn't come to conclusions which you want. It doesn't come to conclusions that I want. I have for now 30 years believed that we do have to have proportional representation. But I've been unable to convince the electorate of this. I've been unable to convince the Labour Party when I was in it. The SDP championed it. We suffered under that voting system. But, you know, you can't do anything other than go on trying to convince people that the weaknesses of proportional representation and its strengths are in favour of change. We had an AV referendum in this country, I might remind you, only just recently. I personally think the AV system is absurd because you can get a very unequal result from it. And I think it was inevitable. We stood on that. And I'd say to our Liberal Democrat in the audience who spoke, that by putting a system which had inherently within it capacity to have an unfair result, you result. But that's our democracy. I will go on arguing for proportional representation. I will go on arguing that the moment, as I hope that we decide to lead, is the moment to go back onto the Scottish issue and the Welsh issue and Northern Ireland and to bind them more into the UK. It's an indictment of us that so many, and particularly young people in Scotland, were so disillusioned they were ready to vote for independence. And I think if we trust and believe in our democracy, which we do, we have inherent within this referendum a continuing commitment to try and make it better. So I don't believe this argument stops. I think I would agree probably with a lot of what there are some strengths in the proportional systems of government which exist almost throughout the whole of the European Union. There are some strengths in having a vehicle for conversations on many of these issues which involve other nations and trying to pool knowledge and experience. And that is, I may say, is the element of structure which works in NATO. So we can learn from it, and I do not wish to argue that this referendum decision means that our democracy has to stand still and can't change. But at the end of the day, you have to convince people, you have to win the argument, and we've not been able to do it. Those of us like you and I who think that our democracy is far from effective and does need to be changed. So it's the argument after the 23rd of June. Yeah. You must make your mind up how you vote on the 23rd. Look, the situation in Northern Ireland changed in 1923, and we gave rights to Irish people in this country, which have, broadly speaking, stayed the same, and they will stay the same if we come out of the European Union. They're very complicated. We treat them, all people in the island of Ireland, very differently from any other European member state. And it goes back to the whole of the settlement in 23, which didn't prove to be a lasting settlement. I do believe that if I was putting in the balances of argument, it has been quite a help in breaking through the IRA and ending almost the violence in Northern Ireland, that we had an Irish partner who was also with us in the European Union. And I think it would be foolish not to say it wasn't anything the EU necessarily of itself did, but we were able to look at our problems between Dublin and London in a different way. And I think that was a great help. And we must retain all of that friendship and relationship between Dublin and London that built up over those years when we come out of the European Union. And one of the ways to do it is to demonstrate to them that they will still have all those rights in this country, access to welfare, coming in under different rules and regulations. So nothing will change, and I profoundly believe nothing will change in the relationship between the political parties in the South and of our arrangements for power sharing in the North. So of this issue, remain or leave, I see no difference, whichever way you vote, in the way that we will deal with the problem of Ireland, which is still with us, not by any means totally solved, but heading, thankfully, in a much better direction than it was. And sometimes I make some criticism of our politicians, but I believe John Major really started a big movement towards solving this problem, and I pay tribute to him. And also Tony Blair made a very considerable contribution, perhaps one of the best features of his prime ministership in dealing with Northern Ireland. And the two parties, the three parties, Liberals too, have shown on the handling of Northern Ireland a degree of bipartisanship over the last 20 to 30 years, which I hope we will start to see working together in handling the transition out of the European Union. Well, I said I had some involvement in lobbying way back. So look, let's try to be objective. We come to these issues, most of us, with, to some extent, prejudices. It is very hard for anybody in this area to cut themselves completely off from this. We must not get into the habit of always saying everything that you don't like to hear is wrong. There's usually some truth in every criticism, and that includes of ourselves personally. And I think we have to have that degree of range. The problem is, and I think it was very well demonstrated, was in the answer to a question about why the Treasury model hadn't looked at the other side. They said that's the responsibility of the people who went in the lead. But the very issue of taking something from the Treasury is they serve us all, and they should have modelled the other option. This is what is so grotesque in the performance of the government. And there are two people who are responsible for this. There are three, actually. The first is the Prime Minister, the second is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the third is the Cabinet Secretary, who's given an overall brief on maintaining the independence of our civil service. Now, you cannot use the model Treasury. If you want to put it, this is the Chancellor's view, that's a political view. But once you say the Treasury, and similarly for Madame Lagarde and the IMF, there is deep unease in these organisations about the way that this has been handled. And objectivity, certainly from the Treasury, has not been there, and many, many other government departments. That is our objection to it. Now, I do think that there will be a difficult period. It's very hard to know what will happen. That is why I've argued that the Prime Minister should stay, that the government should not add to our problems by having a leadership election in the Tory party. I think that would be... The problem this is an issue is that David Cameron said, all through the Scottish election, that if it was to come out, he would stay as Prime Minister. We now hear from diaries and others that he actually intended to leave. I say again, I think it is his duty to stay. And I think we've got to look at this whole question of how we get into this position. It's not easy to model options, and we have all here said that there are options. Why I'm very against signing Article 50 on the 24th of June is I want to look at these options, and I want discussions. If you read Article 50, it's quite hard to actually discover what an interpretation of it. If it is that they are not prepared to enter any trade agreement that does not have a provision for free movement of labour, we better not spend 2 years finding that out 2 years later. We better know if that is it, and they won't, as was said, have a bilateral trade agreement. And the UKIP position is very similar to Vote Leave. It is to go for WTO and add to it bilateral agreement with the EU, who are closest neighbours, on whom we have agreed in the single market a whole raft of issues, and to take out those areas of common agreement and leave aside one of the big areas of disagreement, which is freedom of movement of labour. That's what we have to find out. So it's very hard. And so we have effectively said no to the Norwegian model, which does mean carrying on free movement and also paying in a sum of money for it. I'm perfectly prepared to pay my fair share of a bilateral trade agreement if it involves a bureaucracy that has to be. I don't even need that. So this is the trouble. It is very hard for these people to do it. But they put up the options which we've all said we won't do. And then they put WTO with no bilateral agreement between us. And we're told that it won't happen. So it's very difficult to model something which is ruled out. At the moment, the European Union is saying there will be no deal. We hear this vindictive talk. I think it's all nonsense. It usually comes from commissioners or people who are involved in the bureaucracy of the EU. I haven't yet heard it from a grown-up, adult politician elected from the country that has actually got a substantial amount of trade in this country. So we need to find that out in the next few months. And only when we know that in principle they're ready to have a bilateral trade agreement without freedom of movement of labour should we sign up for Article 50. I've never said this before. Personally, I think we should be much more blunt now in the next few weeks about this issue. And we should take on this area which has been deliberately left vague. And I think that this is my own feeling now. It was not possible in the last 2 or 3 months with this hysterical debate. Now it's quite clear that we are still level pegging effectively. We've withstood this barrage. We're in this process of PERDA, where hopefully will be a rather more imaginative debate. And I think we should spell it out. It is actually quite clear. If there is a serious prospect of a bilateral agreement, we will enter into discussions. If there is no possibility of a bilateral agreement, then we will have to look at other options. And that is, what can you do within the WTO? And there comes, you could almost call it the Singapore option. It is possible to live in a tariff-free world, you know, and it would be bold. And you can certainly not make that decision until you've worked it through in proper Treasury models, in a proper cabinet discussion and proper Parliament. And we would have to really, on the 24th of June, we would have to tell the Treasury, we now want the alternative options. We need to go through all these things. So we've got to get away from thinking that there's civil service against us. The person who decided what was put into the Treasury model was Osborne. That's the facts of life. It was not a proper capital analysis. I am sad, I can say it no higher than that there hasn't been a principled resignation yet from the Treasury. There has been effectively this man in the Bank of England who said, he didn't deny the governor's right to say his view, but he was prepared to break ranks. And in this situation, somebody, and I believe it will happen, will break ranks in the Treasury and will expose the bogus nature of the Treasury analysis. And I hope somebody does it in the IMF too. Yeah.